In the shadows of American politics, a blueprint was being crafted. While most Americans were focused on the daily headlines and campaign rallies, a network of conservative strategists was quietly assembling what they called the most comprehensive governmental transformation plan in modern history. This wasn't just another political transition. This was something entirely different. Have you ever wondered how a political movement could systematically reshape an entire government in just 18 months? The answer lies in a meticulously crafted strategy that most people have never heard of, despite its massive implications for every American citizen. What I'm about to reveal to you isn't speculation or conspiracy theory. This is documented fact, pulled from hundreds of pages of strategic planning documents, and confirmed by the very architects themselves. My name is dedicated to uncovering the political strategies that shape our nation. And after months of research, I've discovered something that will fundamentally change how you understand the current political landscape. The plan I'm going to walk you through today represents the most ambitious attempt to restructure American government since the founding of our republic. But here's what makes this different from every other political promise you've ever heard. This isn't just talk. The implementation has already begun. Before I dive into the specifics, let me give you some context that will make everything else make perfect sense. In April 2023, while most Americans were going about their daily lives, the Heritage Foundation published a document that would become the secret roadmap for transforming America. This wasn't just another think tank report that gets filed away and forgotten. This was a 900-page operational manual designed to be implemented immediately upon taking power. The Heritage Foundation isn't some fringe organization. They've been shaping conservative policy for decades, but this project represented something unprecedented in their history. Kevin Roberts, the president of Heritage, didn't mince words about their intentions. He declared they were orchestrating what he called a second American Revolution, and he made it clear that this revolution would happen whether the opposition cooperated or not. Now, you might be thinking this sounds like typical political rhetoric. Politicians always promise dramatic change, right? But here's where this story takes a fascinating turn. The Heritage Foundation didn't just create a policy wish list. They built a comprehensive machine designed to overcome every obstacle that traditionally slows down political transitions. Think about it this way. When most new administrations take office, they spend months just figuring out how government works. They struggle to find qualified people to fill thousands of positions. They get bogged down in bureaucratic processes that can take years to navigate. The Heritage Foundation looked at these traditional limitations and said, "We're going to eliminate every single one of these problems before we even take power." Their solution was brilliant in its simplicity and terrifying in its scope. They created what amounts to a governmental takeover kit. First, they wrote detailed instructions for reshaping every single federal agency. Second, they compiled a database of pre-vetted loyalists ready to be installed in key positions throughout government. Third, they drafted executive orders that could be signed immediately to bypass normal legislative processes. But the most ingenious part of their strategy was something they called flooding the zone. Steve Bannon, one of the key strategists behind this approach, explained it perfectly. Instead of trying to implement one major change at a time and giving opponents the chance to organize resistance, they would launch dozens of initiatives simultaneously. The opposition wouldn't know which battles to fight first, allowing the most important changes to slip through while everyone was distracted. This wasn't theoretical planning. The Heritage Foundation knew exactly who their candidate would be, and they spent years preparing for his return to power. They studied every mistake from the first administration and developed solutions for each one. Where the first term had been characterized by chaos and infighting, the second term would be marked by unprecedented coordination and efficiency. The personnel strategy alone represents a complete revolution in how American government operates. For over a century, our federal workforce has been protected by civil service laws designed to prevent political interference with day-to-day government operations. Career professionals serve across multiple administrations, providing continuity and expertise regardless of which party holds power. The Heritage Foundation identified this system as the primary obstacle to implementing their vision. They couldn't reshape government if career employees could resist or slow down their initiatives. Their solution was Schedule F, a classification that would strip civil service protections from potentially hundreds of thousands of federal workers. Russell Vought, one of the key architects of this plan, didn't hide his intentions. He wanted federal employees to wake up every morning not wanting to go to work because they were increasingly viewed as villains. He wanted to put the bureaucracy in trauma. This wasn't about improving government efficiency. This was about eliminating any internal resistance to their agenda. The scope of changes they envisioned goes far beyond typical conservative policy preferences. They planned to fundamentally alter the relationship between federal and state governments, between the executive branch and other branches of government, and between government and individual citizens. Every aspect of American life would be touched by their reforms. On immigration, they didn't just want tougher border security. They planned mass deportation operations using military resources for domestic law enforcement. On social issues, they didn't just want to limit certain programs. They wanted to eliminate legal protections that have existed for decades and prosecute activities that are currently legal. On government structure, they didn't just want to reduce regulations. They wanted to eliminate the independence of federal agencies and concentrate unprecedented power in the hands of political appointees. On civil rights, they didn't just want to roll back recent changes. They wanted to redefine fundamental concepts of equality and discrimination. The timeline for implementing these changes was as ambitious as the changes themselves. Unlike typical political transitions that unfold over years, the Heritage Foundation planned to accomplish their core objectives within the first 18 months of taking power. They understood that political momentum is temporary, and opposition forces eventually organize effective resistance. Susie Wiles, who would become Chief of Staff, explained their thinking perfectly. The midterm elections in 2026 could change the congressional landscape, so they had a narrow window to implement their most controversial initiatives. 100 days, 6 months, 18 months. These were their benchmarks for complete transformation. What makes this strategy particularly effective is how it exploits the normal confusion that accompanies any presidential transition. While opponents are trying to understand what's happening and organize responses, the Heritage Foundation team would be implementing changes faster than anyone could track. By the time people realized the scope of what was occurring, the new systems would already be in place. The personnel database they created represents, perhaps, the most sophisticated political appointment system in American history. Instead of scrambling to find qualified candidates after taking office, they spent years identifying and vetting thousands of potential appointees. Every position, from cabinet secretaries to mid-level administrators, had pre-screened candidates ready to be installed immediately. This database wasn't just about finding people with the right qualifications. It was about finding people with the right loyalty. The Heritage Foundation understood that implementing their vision required appointees who would follow orders without question, even when those orders conflicted with traditional governmental norms or legal precedents. The integration between this planning document and actual governance decisions would become clear once implementation began. Despite public denials during the campaign, the connections between Heritage Foundation recommendations and real policy decisions would be undeniable. At least 18 contributors to their planning document would receive significant appointments, and nearly 2/3 of early executive actions would mirror their recommendations. But the most important thing to understand about this strategy is that it was never really about any single election or any single politician. Kevin Roberts made this clear when he described his role as institutionalizing a particular political movement. This was about creating permanent changes that would outlast any individual administration and reshape American government for decades to come. The financial backing behind this transformation reveals just how seriously the architects took their mission. This wasn't some grassroots movement operating on hope and volunteer energy. The Heritage Foundation and their allied organizations commanded resources that dwarfed typical political operations. They understood that reshaping an entire government required unprecedented investment in planning, personnel, and implementation. What emerged from their strategic sessions was something political scientists had never seen before. Traditional governmental transitions rely on existing institutional knowledge and gradual policy shifts. The Heritage Foundation rejected this entire framework. They designed their approach around the assumption that existing institutions were fundamentally corrupt and needed to be dismantled rather than reformed. The psychological warfare component of their strategy deserves particular attention because it reveals the sophistication of their thinking. They didn't just want to change policies. They wanted to change how Americans thought about the role of government itself. Every initiative was designed to serve dual purposes: immediate policy implementation and long-term cultural transformation. Consider how they approach the concept of expertise in government. For generations, Americans had accepted that complex policy issues required specialized knowledge and experience. The Heritage Foundation identified this assumption as a weakness they could exploit. They promoted the idea that common sense and political loyalty were more valuable than technical expertise or institutional memory. This wasn't accidental messaging. They conducted extensive research into public attitudes toward government and identified specific psychological triggers that would make their reforms seem reasonable to ordinary citizens. When career employees raised concerns about proposed changes, those concerns could be dismissed as bureaucratic resistance rather than legitimate expertise. The communication strategy they developed around their initiatives was equally sophisticated. They understood that Americans would reject their agenda if it were presented in its full scope all at once. Instead, they packaged each component as a response to specific problems that most people already recognized: immigration chaos, government inefficiency, cultural decline, economic stagnation. Every reform was positioned as a common-sense solution to issues that frustrated average Americans. But the real genius of their approach was how they turned criticism into confirmation of their narrative. When opponents raised alarms about the radical nature of their plans, those warnings were dismissed as evidence of establishment panic. When career government employees expressed concerns, those concerns were cited as proof that the system needed fundamental change. Every form of resistance became justification for more aggressive action. The technology infrastructure they built to support their transition efforts represented another unprecedented innovation. They didn't rely on traditional political networks or party machinery. Instead, they created parallel systems that could operate independently of existing Republican organizations. This gave them complete control over messaging, personnel decisions, and implementation timelines. Their digital operations were particularly sophisticated. They developed comprehensive databases that tracked not just potential appointees, but also potential obstacles throughout the federal bureaucracy. They knew which career employees might resist their initiatives and had strategies prepared for each scenario. They mapped out the decision-making processes in every agency and identified the key pressure points where their people could exert maximum influence. The legal strategy they developed was perhaps the most important element of their entire approach. They understood that their reforms would face immediate court challenges, so they spent years developing legal theories that would justify their actions. They didn't just want to win individual cases. They wanted to establish new precedents that would permanently expand executive power. Their interpretation of unitary executive theory provided the constitutional framework for concentrating unprecedented authority in the presidency. According to their analysis, the Constitution gave the president complete control over the executive branch, including agencies that had traditionally operated with some degree of independence. This wasn't just academic theorizing. This was the legal foundation for eliminating checks and balances that had constrained presidential power for decades. The international dimension of their strategy reveals how they understood the global implications of their domestic agenda. They weren't just planning to change American government. They were planning to change America's role in the world. Every international agreement, alliance, and commitment was evaluated through the lens of whether it advanced their vision of American sovereignty and traditional values. Their approach to federal agencies demonstrates the systematic nature of their thinking. They didn't just want to reduce the size of government. They wanted to eliminate entire categories of federal activity that they considered illegitimate: environmental protection, civil rights enforcement, consumer safety regulation, scientific research that contradicted their worldview. All of these functions were targeted for either elimination or complete transformation. The education component of their strategy was particularly revealing because it showed their long-term thinking. They understood that political changes could be reversed by future elections, but cultural changes could last for generations. Their plans for reshaping federal education policy weren't just about immediate budget cuts or program eliminations. They were about fundamentally altering how Americans understood concepts like equality, diversity, and scientific truth. The healthcare implications of their agenda were equally comprehensive. They didn't just want to eliminate specific programs or regulations. They wanted to redefine the relationship between government and individual health decisions. Their plans would affect everything from reproductive rights to medical research to public health emergency responses. The economic philosophy underlying their entire approach represented a return to pre-New Deal conceptions of federal authority. They rejected decades of precedent regarding government's role in economic regulation, worker protection, and market oversight. Their vision was of an economy largely free from federal interference, regardless of the consequences for individual workers or communities. What made their strategy particularly dangerous to opponents was how it exploited the normal functioning of American democracy. They used democratic processes to implement changes that would make future democratic reversals much more difficult. Once their personnel were installed throughout the federal bureaucracy, once their legal precedents were established, once their cultural changes took root, undoing their work would require far more than simply winning elections. The timeline pressure they created was intentional and strategic. By moving faster than opponents could respond, they ensured that resistance would always be reactive rather than proactive. By the time people understood what was happening, the new systems would already be operational and defended by people whose careers depended on their success. The most chilling aspect of their implementation strategy was how they weaponized the very institutions Americans trusted to protect democracy. They understood that most citizens assumed constitutional safeguards would automatically prevent authoritarian overreach. The Heritage Foundation identified this assumption as their greatest tactical advantage. While people debated whether certain actions were appropriate, those actions would already be reshaping the fundamental structure of American government. Their approach to the judicial system reveals the depth of their strategic thinking. They didn't just want to appoint conservative judges. They wanted to create a legal environment where their most controversial policies would be protected from future challenges. Every court appointment was evaluated not just for ideological alignment, but for willingness to embrace expansive theories of executive power that would insulate their reforms from judicial review. The propaganda apparatus they constructed deserves special attention because it shows how they plan to maintain public support while implementing deeply unpopular policies. They understood that Americans would accept dramatic changes if those changes were presented as responses to immediate crises. Their communication strategy was built around creating a constant sense of emergency that would justify extraordinary measures. Consider how they framed their personnel purges. Instead of admitting they were replacing experienced professionals with political loyalists, they described their actions as draining the swamp and eliminating deep state resistance. Every career employee who raised concerns about their policies became evidence of institutional corruption rather than legitimate expertise warning about dangerous consequences. Their economic messaging followed the same pattern. When their policies produced negative outcomes for ordinary Americans, those outcomes were blamed on previous administrations or foreign interference, rather than acknowledged as natural consequences of their choices. They created elaborate narrative structures that could explain away any failure while taking credit for any success, regardless of actual causation. The international intelligence community was particularly concerned about the national security implications of their strategy. When you replace experienced intelligence professionals with political appointees, when you eliminate career diplomats who understand complex international relationships, when you subordinate national security decisions to political considerations, you create vulnerabilities that hostile nations can exploit. But the Heritage Foundation viewed these concerns as further evidence of establishment resistance to necessary change. In their worldview, the existing national security apparatus was itself a threat to American sovereignty because it constrained presidential decision-making and maintained relationships with international partners who might not share their vision of American interests. Their approach to crisis management was equally revealing. Traditional administrations prepare for emergencies by strengthening institutional capacity and maintaining professional expertise across all government functions. The Heritage Foundation prepared for crises by concentrating decision-making authority and eliminating potential sources of internal disagreement about how to respond. This difference in approach would have profound implications during any serious emergency. When you need rapid, coordinated responses to complex challenges, having experienced professionals who understand how systems work becomes critically important. When you've replaced those professionals with political appointees whose primary qualification is loyalty rather than expertise, your response capacity is fundamentally compromised. The psychological impact on federal employees was an intentional component of their strategy, rather than an unfortunate side effect. They wanted career professionals to feel unwelcome and uncertain about their futures, because uncertain employees are less likely to resist policy changes or raise concerns about implementation problems. Fear became a management tool for ensuring compliance with directives that violated traditional professional standards. Now, you understand the machinery behind what many considered impossible. This wasn't just another political campaign making grand promises. This was a systematic dismantling and reconstruction of American government, planned years in advance and executed with military precision. The question isn't whether these changes are happening. The question is whether enough Americans will recognize what's occurring before it becomes irreversible. Democracy doesn't die in darkness. It dies in broad daylight while people debate whether what they're seeing is really as dangerous as it appears.